What's going on, everyone? Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. I'm your host, Max Torres with ScoopDuck on 3, coming to you on Thursday, March the 13th, 2025. Happy Friday, Junior, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. Glad to have you guys tuned in for another episode of the pod. Spring football gets kicked off in Eugene today. We got some big recruits to talk about as well for Dan Lanning and company. But first, we'll get into a little bit of talk about some Oregon hoops. And Dana Altman joining me is ScoopDuck owner and publisher Justin Hopkins. J-Hop, how are you?
Good. Been an active morning in the Oregon sports space, and so there's been a lot to talk about. So it's been a fun day.
It has been a fun day. Lots going on, whether we're talking spring football or some hoops. It's always fun, as we say in our line of work, when there is stuff to talk about. And Dana Altman, the Ducks get a 72-59 win over Indiana out there in Indianapolis in the first round of the Big Ten tournament. Actually, might have been the second round. I think they might have had a bye. Sorry about that. But they got a win in their first game in the Big Ten tournament, and it was an impressive showing from the Ducks.
Yeah, no, it was a good win. It was back and forth game. Obviously, Oregon. I don't want to say they started out sluggish, but their key guys did. I mean, we know that this thing kind of goes with Shellstad and Biddle. Biddle did not have one of his big performances that he's been having. Was very key in rebounds, very key on defense with blocks. He did a lot of things, just didn't score a lot of points. So he was very valuable in this game. But conversely, that means it was nice to see Bamba and Angel and, Shellstad still had double digits. But seeing those guys step up and fill that scoring gap, not leaning on 25 or 35 or whatever from Biddle, just really rounds out this team. And that's a good Indiana team. That was a home court game for them being in Indianapolis. And, Oregon started out and the tournament, if you will. And I didn't particularly care for the reffing. I thought Oregon got hosed on a few calls, but it didn't matter. Oregon was able to put them away. And again, kind of a nice team effort, team win there. And now they draw the number 1 seed, Michigan State.
Like you said, Justin, not a particularly strong game from Nate Biddle. 36 minutes, 7 points on 2 of 8 shooting from the floor, but he did grab 8 boards and had 6 assists. So found other ways to be impactful, and I think that's important in any player. And then the Ducks got a great showing from Shellstad, their leader, who led all scorers with 18 points. So we'll see how the Ducks can do. Can they keep the momentum rolling? Dana Altman has his squad rolling here in March. Any final basketball notes you wanted to add real quick?
No, just because it's hard for us to do a podcast knowing that they play again tomorrow at 9 a.m. against Michigan State. So, I don't want anything to be too outdated for folks that might listen to the podcast tomorrow because they may have already played Michigan State by this time. So I guess we'll see. Just excited that they made it past Indiana, and we'll see this game tomorrow.
Looks like the Ducks are now at 8 wins in a row, I think, under Dana Altman. So they are rocking and rolling. You know who else is rocking and rolling? Dan Lanning and the Oregon football team as the Ducks kick off spring practice in Eugene on Thursday morning. Things looked a little bit different around the HDC as we're obviously seeing some renovations going on at the practice fields. The Ducks kicked things off in spring inside Autzen Stadium, and Oregon's head coach met with local media for about 15 minutes or so. I was telling you before we recorded here that I thought we got a little bit more from Lanning than I expected. If you're ever taking any bets or guesses on how long Lanning's going to talk, I always say take the under, unless they're coming off of a win. I don't know. After a big win, he might want to talk a little bit. But I'll just toss it up to you, Justin. I think there's a couple things that stood out to me, but where do you want to go here as we get spring ball going, and then maybe anything that Lanning said that caught your attention?
Yeah, and so, I mean, I guess to set the table with this being the first spring practice, for those that don't know, 2 spring practices, one today, one Saturday, both closed to the media, okay? There's no media access, so all you get is whatever Dan Lanning or the coaches or whatever players that he makes available to media. That's all you get after practice, whatever they say. So, and that's fine. It is what it is. I've always said this, and I said this back to the Chip Kelly days. You can get away with a lot when you're winning. Okay. It's when you're losing that those things really start getting picked apart and start annoying people. So, Dan Lanning's winning. If he wants to close every practice, it's his right. And people might get a little bit irked, but they're going to let him do it because he's winning. So, to answer your question, yeah, it's a couple practices and they're going to take a couple weeks off and resume back in April. They've done that for, I think, 3-4 years now. partially because of the quarter system, partially because it allows any of those spring enrollees to get in and still participate in like 90% of spring ball. So it's actually a really genius design if you think about it. And these guys still get to enjoy spring break, which it's still nice at the end of the day to be a kid here and there. So, for Oregon, he answered quite a few questions. Like you said, it was about a little less than 15 minutes, which is not the usual. Usually if it's like 10 minutes, you always take the under. If it's 5 minutes, you could probably take the under half the time and still win the bet. 15 is would be a guaranteed under, I would think. But part of that is because media and us as Oregon fans or whatever haven't heard from Lanning since the Rose Bowl loss. So, a couple months since he's been able to answer questions for folks. So I know they had a few more than normal. And a lot of the questions were centered around the very thing that you and I have been talking about and others have been talking about. There's a lot of new faces in Eugene. There's going to be a lot of new guys stepping into roles that are going to be starters, that are going to be key guys, that are going to be, they're not necessarily new faces. They've been in the program. Snackson's making an appearance, I see, our cat. Anyways, a lot of new faces that will be maybe starters on the field, but aren't new faces to the program, right? Guys that have been in the program for a year or 2 years or whatever the case might be. So it's going to be a fun and interesting season. Lanning was asked about that. He was asked about spring game, confirmed once again what we've been saying on ScoopDuck. He's having spring game. He's not going to cancel spring games. We knew that.
Like ever.
It's just, I think I put out a tweet or something that said, there's lions and there's sheep, and clearly Dan's a lion. So, spring games are here to stay in Eugene as long as he's here. And he did mention that Oregon would play actual football in the spring game. It wouldn't just be a showcase or any other nonsense. He's going to have these guys playing some form of football. And talked a lot about Dylan Thieneman, talked a lot about Bear Alexander, talked a little bit about DeCorian Moore, which he was asked about. Running back field, injuries. He quickly shut down the injury question, just said, hey, I'm not talking about injuries. And, those were the main things I took away. And again, I think if you're a coach in Dan Lanning's position with the expectations that they have for this team and this season, the number one thing that I think he said a few times and I took away is spring is now the time for growth. This is the time for development and the time for growth. You're going to find out which players are going to rise to the top. You're going to find out which players are going to kind of make themselves leaders on this team. And then you're going to start building your team around that. So I think that's obviously you don't get those questions answered in the very first spring practice. You probably don't have them completely answered by the last practice in spring ball, but you got a better idea then. And so it was great to hear from him. And I'm sure he was excited to be back out there.
You mentioned DeCorian Moore as a guy that Lanning hit on, and within that answer, it took us one day to get the if you're old enough, you're good enough. If you're good enough, you're old enough. The most common Dan Lanning ism or adage that we've seen since he's been at the helm, but just it was along the lines of DeCorian being vocal and kind of stepping into somewhat of a leadership role. So I think that's exciting to see, but not necessarily a lot to make of that. And then also Dylan Thieneman. I think that's another. Sorry, I got a fire engine or something going by in the background there. Busy street here. But Dylan Thieneman is one of the guys that I think I'm the most intrigued and excited about this spring because you said a lot of new faces. And I think that aside from the offensive line, I think that the secondary is probably the center of that conversation. You have some guys that return there, Dakota Fields, Ifeoma Degwu, Aaron Flowers. But Lanning was talking about how Dylan Thieneman is infatuated with football. I thought that was a really powerful word that we got to hear from Lanning and how he's establishing some standards for the DB group. And I think that that's exactly what you want to hear. And of course, a lot of this, like you said on ScoopDuck, is coach speak, but that's really what Oregon needs. They need a guy to be in that room and kind of set the standard. Like, hey, like not in a cocky or arrogant way, but with Thieneman, it's like, hey, I've played at a high level. I've been productive in this league at this level, and I know what it takes to get it done. So I think having him in that room in this transition or bridge kind of a period for Oregon when you lose a lot of your starters from last year is just what the doctor ordered to help bring those young guys along as well.
Yeah, I think if we're going to talk about guys that, and this is early, right? We're a year out. We're over a year because we haven't even had this NFL draft, but we're over a year out from the NFL draft. If you're talking about a guy that really is hoping to up his NFL stock, I think it's him. I think you're looking at a guy there in Dylan Thieneman that knows with the work, with the effort, with all those little things, what they call the quiet work. You know what I mean? The stuff that you're doing when nobody's watching. Are you watching extra film, doing an extra stretching session, doing an extra, workout session, whatever the case might be. That quiet work really is what shows up on the field in the fall and becomes a difference maker. So I think we look at Thieneman, as a guy that transferred in, but knows that, hey, I might be like, we'll just say a third round guy today. But I think you look at him, it's like that there could be a first round guy there, with the right kind of season. And that's a lot of money on the table, not just money while you're in college, money once you get drafted. There's a lot of money on the table for a guy like that. So, and I think, he was asked about him, as you mentioned, Dylan Thieneman, Barry Alexander. That's probably the next guy that's basically at this point, probably an undraftable prospect. Doesn't mean somebody wouldn't pick him up via free agency or whatever, but he's an undraftable prospect. That's a guy right there with the right kind of season could be an early to mid round kind of guy if things go his way, because he's got all the projectables and he's a defensive lineman. So, I think you heard Lanning talk about those guys. He was asked about them. So, it wasn't necessarily just him opening up. And something else I forgot, but he's asked about the coaching continuity and locking up Tosh Lupoy long term and Will Stein long term. And I think he said a lot of the right things there, just knowing that those guys are there to stay for a long time, and having that continuity is what helps a program become really good.
I want to talk a little bit more in a sec here about Lanning, talking about Stein and Tosh, but let's go back to Bear real quick, because he's one of those guys that comes in from the portal. I mean, you could make the argument that has the biggest spotlight on him, right? Because there was all this hoopla around how he chose to redshirt and then his exit from USC. So if there's someone that has very high expectations or something to prove on this team that came over from the transfer portal, it would probably be Bear Alexander. And everything we've seen on social media looks like it's exciting, and he's ingratiating himself in Eugene and the program. But I'm kind of curious to your point about where he could end up in the NFL draft. Like, just what defines success for Bear Alexander this season, but also how does the staff view kind of where he needs to be? Like, is it like he could be a Derek Harmon type of guy? I mean, that's looking right now like Oregon's most promising first round prospect potentially, or is it like, hey, no, I mean, that's too high of a bar to set? Because Harmon, I think, was one of the leading pressure generators last year, QB pressures. So I'm just excited to see how Alexander can develop, and watching his development alongside some of these younger guys like Tion Gray, like Zadavian Sims or Aiden Breland, Jericho Johnson, some Amari Washington, some of these young guys on the D line that we've heard their name, we've seen them a little bit, but 2025 comes around and it's time to step up and really take on a bigger role.
Yeah, I would say this, and I don't think it's come out yet, but I said this on Big Ten. Ted had me on the other day, and I don't think he's finished producing it yet. But one of the things that I said on that show, I'll say it again, is that we all know Dan Lanning's going to always prioritize defensive line. Like, he's going to emphasize that position group through the transfer portal, through recruiting, and make sure that they have talent and make sure they have depth. We know he's going to do that. And to me, one thing that just kind of stood out is, if you take a look at the action here, he only took one defensive lineman through the portal this year, and it was Bear Alexander, right? So I believe that Dan Lanning believes in the guys that they already had. And I think when they decided to take Bear Alexander as a transfer, it told me two things. A, that they already trust the guys they have on the roster, okay? But B, they also saw that Bear Alexander basically really, I don't want to say came in for free, because I don't want to use that terminology, but they got him basically for a minimal cost and could have a possibly high production coming out of it. So they, talked to him and evaluated him and kind of got a feel there and decided, hey, we can bring this guy in. He could potentially be a first rounder, because he 100% could be a first rounder if everything went right. And we're basically kind of out nothing if it doesn't materialize. So, those two things can be true. It doesn't mean that they brought Barry Alexander in because they didn't believe in the group. I just think they saw an opportunity that was too good to pass up by bringing him in. And to me, it also tells me that they were confident in what they have. You pick the name: Omari Washington, Aiden Breland, Zadavian Sims. There's a lot of guys in there, and I think they're all going to contribute this year.
So for Oregon, it's like you bring in Barrel Alexander, and it's like if he pans out, awesome. But if things don't go great and we don't kind of get as much out of him as we thought we were going to, we got a whole room of dudes that are chomping at the bit, ready to get on the field and get after that QB. So love that point for sure. The other point I wanted to maybe wrap up the team talk on today, Justin, was Will Stein and Tosh Lupoi, because all the talk has been about Lanning's contract extension, or new contract, or whatever the word you want to use is, but he's going to be in Eugene through 2030. That's huge. And the point I think I want to get at with this is that I think Oregon's just so strategic about how they generate momentum and build on momentum. Not a lot's happened on the recruiting trail right now, right? Everybody's talking about USC, how they're the number one class now in 26. Well, Oregon's not like they've fallen dramatically. They're at number 2, but it's like, okay, how can we get ourselves in the headline here? How can we generate some positive stuff around the program? Okay, we're going to extend Lanning, and then we're going to double down and extend Tosh and extend Stein. And generating that continuity and stability is going to pay dividends just over and over again on the recruiting trail and with guys that are inside that building. So I think the stability and continuity that you create with making a move like that is invaluable. You can't really place a dollar amount on it, although they obviously have, and it's a pretty hefty amount. So it's just a great development for Oregon here in the spring, and then I think we have some more recruiting that we're going to get to later on here in the show.
Well, and it's such a what I want to say. It's such a safe and natural way to create some momentum, I think, a little bit. And you're not going and doing anything that's wasteful or that you probably wouldn't already do, right? I'm sure, Dan and Oregon already agreed that, hey, we're gonna do some, new contract things here. Well, guess what? Can we time it around the time where this 5-star quarterback is on campus and close to making a decision? Yeah, let's get it done. I mean, again, these are all things that you're going to do, and it's just a matter of the timing. And I think to execute those things, they're not fake manufacturing momentum. And I'm not going to single anybody out in particular, but that can be done on the recruiting trail, and there are lots of ways to do that. So, I just love to see the commitment on both sides, the commitment of Oregon and the commitment of Dan Lanning and those coaches to say, hey, look, I like being here. Lock me up long term. I'm good. I want to be here in Oregon, saying, hey, yeah, we value you being here. We don't need to give you a new contract, but we want to. We want to keep you here. We want to commit to winning like we're doing and see this thing continue to grow. So those are the things that, maybe it pays off a little bit with a Jared Curtis commitment potentially, but long term, it's going to help Dan Lanning when he goes out on the road this spring, or when he brings these guys in the spring and says, hey, look, I'm not going anywhere. Look at my contract. There's no hot seat. There's no anything. And so, all those things are really good. And I did write an article this week, did talk a little bit about USC, but, in the article, I really just kind of outlined where Oregon has been recruiting wise the last 2 years, the last 2 full cycles under Dan Lanning, and where they are currently. They're actually well ahead of where they usually are at this time. And by the way, those were top 3 recruiting classes those last 2 cycles. So, again, for those that are panicking, yeah, USC's getting some stuff going. I'm not going to discredit them. They've turned things around. Can they keep things turned around? I don't know, because we thought they did last year, and it fluffed again, and they dropped out of the top 10 in recruiting. And Oregon again finished in the top 5. They were as high as number 2, I think, when signing day closed. But then obviously the Dallas Wilson saga and the Jaron Chiave Sagapola Tale drama, those 2 dropped off the list, and Oregon dropped to 3 or 4. I can't remember, but my point stands. Don't freak out about Oregon recruiting in mid-March. Dan's going to do the bulk of his work May, June, July, and a little bit in August. That's when you're going to see Oregon push for those big commitments. And it's the safe play because you're a lot closer to those kids signing than they are in March.
And we know, of course, that Dan Lanning has really cemented his status as a closer on the recruiting trail. I mean, just look at the way that they've kind of put some exclamation marks on these classes the past couple of years. Naeem Offord last year being the biggest one, I think that we can all point to, and then JKS for a minute. I mean, I wasn't expecting that to happen, but it did. So take whatever you want from that. Let's transition into some more recruiting talk, Justin. But before we do that, we got to make sure that we keep the listeners and the viewers in the loop. We're running a promo right now over on ScoopDuck. You can try us out. $1 for your first week, part of our March Madness sale over at On3. And if you're here on YouTube, you can see my tweet. I said, if you're an Oregon fan and you like to follow recruiting, ScoopDuck is the only place to be. Tons of stories right now over on ScoopDuck.com, interviews with top targets, top commits. Tamahini Tapoy, a modern-day defensive lineman that is committed to Oregon and getting recruited by USC. Got an interview with him. Cody Green, one of the top tackles in the country who's committed to Oregon and also getting recruited by USC. We got updates over there. Justin posted the visitor list for this week/weekend. So that's the place to be. It really is. So just want to make sure you guys know about that and head on over there to check us out.
Yeah, I mean, I speak confidently on this. There's just nobody out there doing what we're doing consistently. And I mean, it's all things. We're bringing Scoop. Max is doing a tremendous job getting interviews with these guys. So you're hearing the words coming right out of their very own mouth. Visitor lists, everything. We're trying to do everything we can to give people, the most for their buck. And all of that allows us to, continue doing what we're doing, including recording this podcast. So tell a friend, tell a family member, whatever, post it on Facebook. But we appreciate the support. And again, your support is what allows Max and I to do this as our day job instead of it moonlighting as recruiting guys.
There you go. Couldn't have said it better myself. So check us out. Spread the word. Come see us at Scoop Duck and come listen to the Ducks Dish podcast. Like the ticker says at the bottom, Oregon is hosting an impressive batch of recruits here as spring practice gets underway. Only 2 days, Justin, Thursday and Saturday, like you mentioned, but boy, are the Ducks taking advantage of that. I wrote a story over on Scoop Duck, the 5 most important visitors that are expected in town this week. A number of them already on campus. I think really for me, the guy that I started this one off with, my story wasn't necessarily in Eddie order. We can debate this a bit if we want here, have some back and forth, but I started it off with Talanoa Ely, who we keep talking about. We talked about him, I think, earlier this week on the podcast. Big story with him. He transferred from Orange Lutheran in SoCal, the Trinity League, out to Kahuku in Hawaii, one of the very best programs out there in Hawaii. So he's back on campus now alongside Tamahini Tapoy. So that's another visitor, kind of spoiling it here. But Talanoa Ely visited Oklahoma on Monday. Then he was back home in Southern California. He doesn't get to Kahuku until April 1st, by the way. So he went back home, visited USC, and then now he's at Oregon again. So this is just really becoming, I think, I'd be curious to get your take here, Justin. I think Talanoa and Tom are really becoming the face of Oregon's Southern California efforts in the 2026 class. And that's without even mentioning another guy I had on that list.
No, you're right. Obviously it's very well documented at this point that Oregon and USC are now, ultimately going head to head for recruits. And in years past, we would see that USC is involved with a guy and dismiss him because Dan Lanning continued to stuff Lincoln Riley into a locker and give Riley credit. He's fought his way out of that locker and they're doing better this year. And, right now, if we're going to talk about that rivalry, that recruiting rivalry, if you will, and let's be fair, a lot of Duck fans are like, man, why are we talking about USC? Well, why bring up USC? Well, they are improved. You need to respect what they're doing, and you need to respect what they offer as a program because that is a blue blood in college football. But lastly, and the biggest point I'll make about that, they weren't going to stay down forever, but the biggest point is, I missed the Pac-12 just like all of you, okay? But the good old days are gone, all right? And now we're in the Big Ten, and forging some new rivalries with Ohio State or Michigan or whatever. But ultimately, USC is now kind of like one of our oldest rivals as an Oregon fan or alum or whatever. Washington is not recruiting anywhere near the level Oregon is and might not for a while. I don't hate Oregon State, but I don't even know where to put them anymore. Like they're in this weird spot. So yeah, people are like, why are you talking about USC? Well, now they kind of got their shit together, if you will. that's kind of like our oldest rival that we actually have some actual rivalries with out west right now. So it's kind of fun, brings back some old days, and it's fun for if you're Oregon to actually know that you have a shot at being on the winning side of those things, because when Pete Carroll was there, you didn't win any of them. So I've been around that long. But, to answer your question, to get back to Illy, to get back to Tapoy, if I'd made a list and I didn't, I read yours, I would put those guys as 1, 2. You could call it 1A and 1B. I think keeping Tamohini Tapoy is really important for Oregon because of that rivalry, because of his position demand. He's an interior defensive lineman, and because of his skill. He's a really good football player. And then if you're talking about Talanoa Ely, again, really good football player, fills a position of need, SoCal guy, and is right now feeling like an Oregon USC battle. I think those are 1, 2. Yeah, they're not the 2 highest ranked guys coming into town this weekend. I think they're the 2 most important, and they're 1A and 1B for me. So obviously Oregon's just hoping to keep Tom committed and hoping to land Talanoa Ely. And we'll just have to see how those 2 unfold, but it's great to get them back on campus.
Ely told me he's going to head to Provo next week for a visit to BYU. So there's still other schools in the mix here, but I think you and I can both kind of clearly see or confidently say that's looking like an Oregon versus USC battle. Really, both of those guys are, but I think you'll see recruits kind of take trips all over the place just in today's age of recruiting. One more guy I definitely wanted to talk about here that's in town now, currently on campus, is Chris Henry Jr., another modern day guy that we have to talk about, committed to Ohio State, 5-star guy. The story hasn't really changed here, Justin. He told me in my last interview with him at Modern Day, boots on the ground recruiting coverage here at ScoopDuck, he said in like the most, the most uncertain term, the most certain terms in no uncertain terms. I think that's what it is, the expression, that he's going to be at Ohio State as long as Brian Hartline is in Columbus. But we're still talking about him because he's back in Eugene. He keeps showing up at Oregon, and this trip gives him a chance to meet Ross Douglas for the first time. And I think that's obviously crucial with Junior Adams' departure to the Dallas Cowboys. And you could say on the surface that Oregon's chances took a hit when Junior Adams left. And I think you'd be a little bit correct. You wouldn't be incorrect in that statement because Adams was a great recruiter. But Oregon doesn't do recruiting with just one guy. Like, hey, the wide receiver coach is the only guy recruiting the wide receivers. Dan Lanning was involved, and I'm sure a number of other guys were involved too. So you've kind of said it a million times. It feels like just keep chopping wood here with Henry. But I think given the staff developments, I have to say Henry is one of the most important guys in town.
Yeah, I mean, he's the highest ranked. He is a very important guy, but this is the one that I think Oregon has. Well, how do I want to say this? I'm with you, and based on what he said, he's going to be really tough to pull from Ohio State. Okay, I'm not debating that. I think that's going to be really tough. And all you're looking for if you're Oregon today, this weekend, whatever, however long he's here, is just to get him in front of Ross Douglas. Let him show how Coach Douglas coaches at practice. Get him some FaceTime with him. Shake hands. Let Coach Douglas tell him what he's all about. And then you kind of start that thing all over again. And I'm not saying Oregon's starting from scratch because they're clearly not. Like you said, there's team recruiting, and obviously he's got a relationship with Coach Stein and Coach Lanning and others. But this is all about getting, Coach Douglas that FaceTime and letting him really start that relationship, which is going to be pivotal in this recruitment. So I think he's going to be tough to pull away. It'd be a huge get if the Ducks can pull him away. There's no question about that. And again, we're talking about recruiting rivalries. Oregon and Ohio State have been battling and going head to head, and that's become a bit of a new rivalry, but it still doesn't have the tradition like the Oregon USC rivalry does, which is why we talk about it differently. And I think Henry's a big one. And I know we don't want to give away the whole visitor list. It is up at ScoopDuck, and I encourage you guys to check it out because it's got some really good football players on it. But certainly a very fun weekend in Eugene. And I think, if you're Dan Lanning, you're not looking for this to produce a bunch of commits. That's not what this weekend is about. And I think fans need to understand that because I feel like a lot of times fans only, grade these things based on commitments. Like, okay, all these guys showed up, but nobody committed. It was a failure. Not exactly. There's a lot of value in Chris Henry showing up. There's a ton of value in Tom showing up because even by his own statements in your update, Max. He's like, I haven't been to Oregon in a while. I needed to get back and see those guys. And that's exactly what you're after if you're trying to keep him committed is, hey, man, we love you. Let's keep this thing going. Stay with us, and because USC is pushing hard. So, this weekend is not all about commitments. It's really just continuing to lay that foundation. I always say that foundation. I love that word. I love that example because your real work, if you're Dan Lanning, is coming towards the end of April, into May, and then really into June when all these official visits take place.
Yeah, you're not looking for commitments now. And I think a big part of it, too, is part of what you wrote about earlier this week on ScoopDuck is just in the calendar right now. Oregon's at a very different spot than it was a year ago in terms of the progress that they have in filling up this 2026 class. And they're in no rush to fill it all up now, but they have significantly more recruitments now than they did a year ago with the 2025 recruiting class. I think they maybe had like 3 or 4 commitments around this time. And then the spring game came around, and that usually serves as a catalyst to more commitments. So it'll be fun to see how they kind of manage this. We got one more headline that we want to hit on here, Justin, and that is 5-star Oregon tight end commit Kendra Harrison shutting down his recruitment. He's been saying all the right things. I mean, if you guys have been reading me for a while, checking us out at ScoopDuck, we've had a bunch of updates on Harrison. I talked to him after his junior day visit, and he basically told me it feels weird going home. Like, I just love it out here that much. So he's committed to play football and basketball at Oregon in a rare situation and combo. But this is the number 1 tight end recruit in the country, according to On3, top 20 prospect nationally, 6'7", 250 plus. To get the headliner of your class locked in and announcing that he's going to be shutting everything down with some big schools that came after him, right? We got Penn State, Miami, North Carolina, Tennessee, schools like that. They all came calling for Kendra Harrison, and he chose the Ducks. So I think this is great news. And again, just goes to further the point about building momentum in a creative way.
Yeah, in a natural way, right? Because I'm like you, this kid really has done and said all the right things. I know North Carolina refuses to give up, but he has really just never wavered in his commitment to the Ducks. And I think that, this is another thing where you can kind of naturally manufacture some momentum where he simply just kind of comes out and reaffirms and says, hey, I'm locked in with Oregon. That's it. That's the story. That's the tweet. And, every little thing with, again, this all kind of points to Jared Curtis. And why Jared Curtis? Well, because Jared Curtis is probably close to making a commitment, right? So he's in a different area than some of the other recruits we were just talking about. Some of those guys are waiting to take official visits and do this other stuff. Jared Curtis is not. He's probably going to make his decision within the next couple of weeks. So you do all these little things that kind of naturally help there. And then speaking of Jared Curtis, that's a 5-star quarterback. That's the number 1 ranked quarterback. He's going to help you recruit other players. He's going to help you recruit a Chris Henry Jr. He's going to help you recruit these guys on offense, Jackson Cantwell. You pick the name, and that's going to be a big recruiting tool for Oregon. So there's a lot of value there. And again, he's making his decision soon. So yeah, you kind of create a little momentum, maybe for that recruitment, but you're not getting Talanoa Ely on campus and saying, hey, you need to commit this weekend. We need you to commit right now. Let him make his decision when he's ready. You're Oregon. You're in good shape. You don't need to, manufacture that momentum. If it comes, it comes. And if not, you're still going to be just fine. So great to have him, kind of reaffirm that. We do know, and just to touch on it briefly, Oregon is, looking at a second tight end in this class, not because Kendra Harrison isn't good, just simply to, help with depth and future depth at that position because Kenyon Sadiq's not going to be around forever. So Oregon is looking to take another tight end in this class. And again, if you've got Jared Curtis and Kendra Harrison, maybe that other tight end kind of looks at that and says, whoa, I'm going to have other good players around me. This might not be a bad offense for me after all. So, looking at you, Mark Bowman, I guess specifically as Oregon continues to, rely heavily on that modern day pipeline, which has been so good to them the last few years.
And that second tight end in this class is honestly becoming more and more interesting to me because it seems like the volume, if we're just looking at adjusting the volume and how well Oregon is, what their standing is like with a recruit, it seems like that Mark Bowen volume is going way up. And then the Brock Harris one seems like it can't really make up its mind is kind of how I'm going to view it because I thought that Oregon was way out in front for the longest time. Then here comes BYU kind of pushing. I know Michigan's involved. I know Georgia's involved in that one. So I think Israel Briggs, the Arizona State tight end commit, he's another one to keep an eye on. Also a star on the basketball field. or basketball court, excuse me. So there's I think we're in for some twists and turns here, Justin. And I don't know if that's just because Oregon already has 9 commits, but just with USC kind of doing their thing and getting things in order, and then SEC's teams are going to do what SEC teams do. And Ohio State's always a foe. Texas A&M is really announced their presence and strengthened it in Southern California and throughout the state. So it's going to be a fun ride.
Yeah, and that's the thing. The ride's a good word for that. And Duck fans really just have never enjoyed this level of success ever. I mean, at least prior to landing. Yeah, Cristobal had a pretty good year of recruiting, but not like this, not at this level. And here's the thing. I mean, you and I know this, and I hope fans are. This isn't like, hey, we're battling Washington and Arizona for, this such and such 4-star. These are dudes. You are battling Tennessee. You are battling Texas. You are battling Alabama. You are battling Ohio State, Georgia. You're not going to win every battle. Like, you're not. I mean, this is different level of the swimming pool. Like, we're in the deep, deep end. So you need to get used to losing some of these battles because you won't win them all. But you need to enjoy the fact that you're actually in the battle and that you will win some of them. And Oregon continues to sign better classes than we've ever seen in program history. So if you're going to take the good, which I just mentioned, you're going to have to accept some of the bad, which is losing some of those battles, because it's going to happen.
And just goes to show you, recruiting, it's not for the faint of heart. You got some really high highs and some really low lows. It always feels like there's that one recruit every cycle that kind of breaks fans' hearts. I don't know if you could say that it was Dallas Wilson last year. That was obviously a bummer and, a pretty complicated situation for, I'm sure, I don't need to put more out there than people already know, maybe. Then the JKS situation, that was very strange. So we're here for it all. And we just hope that you join us for the ride over at ScoopDuck.com. Remember, $1 gets you a week of access. And the dead period's behind us, Justin. I know we're going to have this 2-week kind of lull with spring ball. But once we get into April, man, it is all gas, no brakes, to quote Steve Sarkisian in Texas. It is just full steam ahead, pedal to the metal, recruiting and spring football. And we're going to have you guys covered through all of it over at ScoopDuck. Any final words here? I know we've gone a little bit longer.
Yeah, I guess final words are maybe recruiting and football is a little quiet for the next 2 weeks, but basketball certainly shouldn't be. So we got plenty going. And by the way, we haven't even talked about it. And we're not going to, but just by the way, last I looked, Oregon baseball, Oregon softball ranked inside the top 10, both nationally. Like, there's a lot going on and a lot to be excited about. So come and support us, and we appreciate you guys doing it so far. But make sure, signing up for YouTube or signing up for, the podcast, whatever's great. Signing up on ScoopDuck is elite. That really helps. It's probably, where it's $1 right now, but it ends up being like $12, I think, every month. It's damn cheap entertainment, and every one of those dollars helps Max and I do what we do on a daily basis.
There you go. Well, if you guys want to find more of Justin, you can follow him at jhopkinssd. Find me anywhere on social media at Torres Sports. Subscribe to the Scoop Duck on 3 YouTube channel, and share the show. Share the Ducks Dish podcast with your friends, with your family, with other Duck fans. But until next time, thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast.